Is it that your limerence is the greatest love story of all time? Or are we just somehow suffering a very similar delusion? Today we're going to be exploring the common themes and stages of limerence and speculate what is the purpose of limerence through a psychoanalytical lens and through this research paper. So often, limerent experiencers, or I should say limerent sufferers, confuse having the reciprocation from the LO as the answer to end their suffering. But even if you're not under the illusion that the LO is the answer, people still find themselves very stuck in that state of suspended fantasy. There are some folks who even choose coming back to that image of the LO over and over, almost like an internal comfort or crutch. But it can't just be that limerence teaches us or shows us how lonely we are. Which brings me to my thesis. Limerence is not about falling in love. It's about self-expansion, to become real, to become authentic, to become whole. All of those require us to focus on our instinctual needs. And I'm going to read this quote here. It says,
Limerence allows more authentic, repressed parts of their personality greater access to conscious living.
I think that right there highlights the power of limerence by giving us greater access to those parts of us that were once dormant in our histories. Today we are going to explore the proposed trajectory of limerence, the different stages that it takes, and the different phases of limerence. Before we get into it, I do want to say that this is not medical or professional advice. This is just my own insight and my own observations from some of my clients and reading some Reddit forums. Please hit the bell to get notified for the latest research on limerence, subscribe, and please let me know if you have any questions or insight. From previous video, I described that there were similarities in the psyche of those who were prone to limerence. We're going to expand that. If we just looked at the limerent experiencer and what it was that they had in common, such as childhood traumas, separation anxieties, some OCD, then we would still be missing the other half of the equation, which is the experience between them and the LO. And what insight they draw from this interaction, we start to see the complexities and we start to see how it is further complicated. To explore this further, I'm going to tie in some of the common limerent themes from this research paper and some psychoanalytic themes from Freud. While Freud is a very controversial figure and his theories have mainly been disproven, they still provide bare bones for the unconscious, involuntary process that I believe limerence goes through and the different developmental stages that relates to this model proposed in this research paper. And as I was gathering information for this particular topic, I came to realize that you can't really talk about limerence and not talk about love. And you can't really explore love from just a biological and a empirical sense. We have to look at love through philosophy, through mythology, and sometimes even art. If we really think about it, right? You can't capture the limerent experience by just measuring your heart racing, perspiration, or oxytocin levels. While those are very helpful and informative for a starting point for empirical research, it's still important to look at this as a whole conscious experience. All that to say, we're going to take a phenomenological approach to talk about the phenomenon of limerence. Only looking at the physiological states of limerence doesn't capture the different reports that people have about how they've been transformed by this experience of limerence in very profound and sometimes existential ways. Before we get into the bulk of the research, I want to read one of the responders' description of limerence. It's very much a journey, which feels positive
at first, like an amazing soulmate experience, but becomes more difficult over time. It seems joyous at the start, but actually robs you of joy in the long run.
That last line right there, it robs you of your joy in the long run. When you're under the possession of limerence, all moral reasoning, all logic goes out the window. Tenov would describe in the original research, there's physiological components to limerence that defies control, and it can reorder the motivational hierarchy with consequent disruption or neglect of other interests, relationships, and responsibilities. And this is why we have to have a scientific inquiry on this topic. So often, people who experience limerence confuse this for falling in love. On the flip side of having this spiritual vigor and vibrancy to our life, it also adds this component of love sickness. People stop eating, people stop working, people will even go out of their way to leave their spouses, break families up, all under the pretense of the love of their life. This misses the whole point of the experience, and so I really think it's important to find the root and the essence of it so that it doesn't become, like many addictions, the center of your life, your higher power. Now, moving on to the paper. The title of it is called Exploring the Lived Experience of Limerence, A Journey Towards Authenticity. You can skip this part if you want to go straight to the two themes that I will be talking about in this particular video. But I always recommend that you look at the setup of any research and see the limitations. I will point out that one of the main limitations to this particular research is the small sample size, which makes it very, very limited. But the reason I chose this particular research is because a lot of the different ways that people would describe it and the categories of the limerence stages that people would go through really spoke to a lot of the feedback that you see online, on Reddit, on YouTube, and it really captures the essence of these stages. That being said, the link is in the bio. Presented here is an interpretive phenomenological analysis to explore the lived experience of international respondents. And it was an open form format, meaning that they wrote their answers down. The limerent experiences are broken into categories: the conditions that were unique, and then those that were common in the journey, conceptualized in a trajectory, generally sequential and then overlapping in superordinate theme. There were 29 categories that were created from the emergent themes. 5 superordinate themes were developed. So it started with 29, and then it came down to 5 very common ones. If you were in the thick of limerence, I would say that 1, 2, and 3 is one that most people are familiar with. Tenov really breaks down in the original research about the highs and lows and the mixed messages of the LO and the need for reciprocation. So that's 1, the ruminative thinking; 2, free-floating anxiety and depression, temporarily fixated; and then 3, the disintegration of the self, which essentially is when somebody is starting to unravel. With number 2, free-floating anxiety, depression, temporarily fixated, what we see in this one in particular is that there are some diagnoses that are most comorbid with those who are prone to limerence, and their diagnosis I find pretty interesting was OCD. This is one of the top articles called Love Variant, which creates a model that illuminates how addictive limerence is and how these scientific findings are very much parallel to the experience of any behavioral addiction. There is a paradigm shift, and these are the last 2 that I want to focus on in particular, which is theme 4 and 5. This paradigm shift follows the realization of the internalized fantasy object. It becomes about personal development and personal insight. So number 4 is the reintegration of past life experiences, and 5 is towards authenticity. This is the final phase of which was termed towards authenticity because these responders report an actual attempts to achieving congruency, which is required for developing insight. A few responders said that the whole of the experience was negative. Majority of them also helped them to self-actualize and to move closer to personal growth. So it gives us a different way of looking at this trajectory of limerence, in that it doesn't have to end poorly. When I see Reddit posts that say, "Did you end up with your limerent object, blah, blah, blah," I think it really misses the point that we can extrapolate existential meaning for ourselves through this experience by not confusing the other as the antidote, but rather the limerence as a catalyst for personal development, for spiritual growth. Now, theme number 4 is titled Reintegration of Past Life Experiences, referred to by one of the responders as the perfect storm. This particular stage follows the disintegration of the self, where essentially the self starts to unravel. This person starts to become confused, they are destabilized, might move into emotional roller coasters. When this starts to happen and then we go into the past life experiences, what do we see? What is common here? This is the way I like to think of it, this particular stage. When you're struck by an illness, like a cold, most people ask, when and where did I catch this cold? This is the same thing that the responders did when they realized that this was some sort of mental state. The responders would try to pinpoint the origin of their limerent episode, which we know in the literature to be called the glimmer. It is the moment that you met this person, what was going on in your life, what was happening that maybe made you more vulnerable to opening yourself up. And then it goes even further back to reintegration of past life experiences. I think glimmer is a perfect word for this because it illuminates aspects to our own unconscious attachments, our own projections. Some of these responders would talk about familiar physical attributes. It could be their smell, it could be their smile, it could be eye contact. But then other responders would talk about familiar themes in their personal dynamics with that LO and their family of origin. So people would talk about rescue fantasies. They would talk about this sense of familiar, a lot of what they had not yet confronted within themselves. One person described it as, the person experiencing
limerence has unmet relational needs, wants, desires, often from childhood, that somehow crystallize into a laser-focused, intense desire for a single person.
The repetitious nature of limerence really speaks to the psychoanalytic literature that Freud speaks on. Repetition compulsion is when we repeat patterns of past traumas. If you have any attachment traumas, you might unconsciously seek partners who are able to trigger those same wounds, hoping to heal them. If we take a deep dive into this, you start to see how this emotional roller coaster that you're in with the LO mirrors these unresolved attachment wounds from childhood. What was also commonly described in this, and why it's called or referred to, as one person put it, the perfect storm situation, was that there were a number of current and previous life experiences that became relevant. Meaning that these things start to come to the forefront. We start to see why it is that they became limerent or vulnerable to limerence in the first place. And one of those things, already having some sort of mental health issues that they were struggling with, such as depression that is unresolved, or going through some sort of life experience related to bereavement, like going through a divorce or unease or boredom in their current relationship. What was notable here, as many of these different responders described, was that there was already some current issues within their personal relationships. It's not just the previous life experiences that become relevant, it's also the current life experiences. And then here comes LO. This specific trigger unleashed all of what was not being confronted in their present situation. One responder in the study said that they came to realize their
lonely internal emotional life, probably influenced by depression, that I sought fantasy life as a means of emotional survival. Dissonance between myself and parents. It is my opinion, and perhaps that of others, that the anxiety component of limerence is a direct reenactment of childhood abandonment anxiety trauma, which itself interfered with health identity development.
And what is it that they get from this limerent fantasy, if not a means of emotional connection and of survival? The next stage of limerence, and the final one as proposed by this research paper, is theme 5, which is towards authenticity. I playfully put it as, limerence is a wish your heart makes. When I think about this last and final phase regarding limerence, think of this kind of as an opportunity to be true to oneself. And there is this interplay of being true to yourself and being true to others. In limerence, this particular mechanism of being true to others is about ridding yourself of these feelings of limerence. When you're riding the highs and lows of limerence, and you often get glimpses of this non-limerent state, you realize, wow, I am going insane. When you start to get really exhausted by the highs and lows of limerence, and you go on the internet to find a solution for limerence, and a lot of people will tell you that disclosing to the limerent object is a way to rid yourself of this limerent state. In theory, that would make sense if you were able to finally secure emotional reciprocation with the other, because it draws on these parallel attachment wounds. At the same time, these projections towards the other people, it's not conducive to having a healthy relationship. One of the responders interestingly said,
I was hoping LO would have been emotionally mature enough to allow me to talk and work through my projections towards her, but that was not the case. I got denial and defense.
Well, of course, if you're trying to maintain friendships with your LO and you're trying to work through your stuff onto them, I think that there is a disconnect, because this particular healing has more to do with your own personal development. So when we talk about moving through that stage of authenticity, the coping mechanism of disclosing is not often what makes limerence go away. I'll talk in another video about this research paper that is quite recent and actually talks about how cognitive behavior therapy can be used in the treatment of limerence. It is my belief that not everyone gets to this stage of moving towards personal insight. This is where I would interject Freud's ideas on wish fulfillment. So I playfully would describe limerence as a wish that the heart makes. Much like limerence, dreams and fantasies go hand in hand in creating a space where one is able to exercise otherwise unacceptable feelings and unacceptable desires. A majority of these LOs happen to be someone where there are many obstacles. Whether they're in a relationship, whether you're in a relationship, there are these obstacles that make the circumstances impossible. So limerent objects then would almost seem arbitrary to healing if it serves as a sort of block. It can't just be that we stay stuck in this repetitious cycle of reliving our personal baggage and of seeing our experience of loneliness. Because there are some moments in limerence where you get a sense of these euphoric feelings and become the person that you want to be. So what is this aspect that we so crave when we are suspended in this particular fantasy? These exciting highs are very life-giving. They give you a sense of purpose, a sense of meaning. As some would put it,
I became upbeat. I became a creative person. At first, I was bursting with the wonderfulness of these new feelings, then guilt and shame. Keeping the feelings contained becomes crazy-making, exhausting and painful.
Let me just backtrack here, and I'm just putting together some ideas. These are theoretical. Melanie Klein, who was one of the contenders of object relations theory, moved away from Freud's psychoanalytical work because he put a lot of emphasis on controlling sexual urges and how that influenced our emotional and psychological development. However, I think that Freud's idea of the repression of sexual urges plays a part in limerence. It was in around 1920 when Freud wrote the essay Beyond the Pleasure Principle, moving away from just our human drive to seek pleasure and move away from pain and away from just libido. A lot of philosophers and Freud started to look at sex as a transcendental experience. It wasn't just about sexual intercourse. He started to come up with basic life forces, eros and thanatos, which is the death wish, which is quite controversial. It's a drive to reduce psychic energy and come back to earlier states. We are going to talk about eros, which derives from the Greek god of love, passion, and life. Eros to Freud was a drive towards pleasure, but also to sustain life. And this is not to be confused with libido, which is exclusively just the sex drive. But this is more about our life force. Limerence is an expression of eros, the god of love. It isn't just about sexual gratification. In reading some forums, and some of those responders from this particular research was that people were interested in their LO sexually and would have sexual fantasies, but some felt like they would contaminate the limerent experience and that would be avoided. Some people just had this pull towards their limerent object and would just want to be near them. And Tenoff actually even notes in the original research that sex is neither essential nor in itself adequate to satisfy the limerent need. Limerence is the desire for more than sex. There was a dualistic nature to eros, which means that it wasn't about just procreation, it's also about developing higher unities. Like friendship is a unity between individuals and beings, and a mother's relation to an embryo to her womb. And they're all part of eros, which is a drive that keeps creating higher unities. Eros really becomes a fundamental drive. What does that mean? Freud never intended for this to read as theological or vitalistic. However, a lot of these things that he describes could not be fully measured. He saw eros as more of genealogical and described it as mutual relationships of cells, that they were passed down from family lines, meaning that you can trace it back to family descent, so that there is almost a repetitious passing down. It is impersonal and it is out of one's awareness. Much like limerence, it is an involuntary process that allows you to create higher unity in defining your sense of will to live, which means that he saw this process as a life force. He saw it as a human drive, not just as a sex drive, and that they weren't in opposition with one another. In thinking about limerence and what it gives people, I started to realize that perhaps what limerence gives you is not just the romantic feelings of the limerent object, but rather that eros and love and life energy was for oneself, and narcissism as an erotic unity with oneself. He started to come into this understanding when he was describing narcissism, realizing that when a child starts to develop that sense of being loved, being held by the womb, able to have access to mom's breast, these were later conditions of love because we weren't able to have that at all times, that we start to get imbued in the sense of having to love on our own. And I kind of think of limerence with this eros energy, trying to love the self, coming back to this return of past conditions, which is passive being loved, is that full sense of being in the womb, being held. There is a long German word for it, which I will not try to say, I will butcher it. But this narcissistic love he described as a real happy love corresponds to the primal condition in which object libido and ego libido cannot be distinguished. Thanatos returns to this inorganic condition, which speaks more to repetition compulsion, where there is this returning to the womb, returning to earlier states and conditions, earlier relationships. In limerence, we know that there is a repetitious aspect to it that many people would describe as familiar, that particular attachment wound, then it starts to get displaced into other types of relationships, which makes sense when we think about the preconditions, that limerence is a way to help people transcend their desire for connection, something beyond sex, beyond the romantic elements that come from the other. Apart from all the psychobabbling, what am I trying to say about limerence here? Is it the greatest love story of all time, or are we just suffering some sort of delusion? Well, I think that love is a temporary and fleeting experience. It doesn't mean that there isn't some sort of drives us to not just procreate, but become better people. All things feel possible with that kind of life force, that life energy. It seems that there is a use for limerence. Is it possible that limerence is there to wake people up, to dive into their emotional landscape, to bring about a sense of wakefulness in our experience? It is about being able to recognize potential for love, both to themselves and to others around them. Will we see more limerence as people continue to feel more disconnected to others, as more people start to repress their desires? Is it a catalyst for finding our own personal meaning? Everything that I'm describing here is theoretical, and these are all just my own ideas tied in with some of this research. Please share any insight from your personal experience with limerence. I appreciate your time. Thank you for watching. Stay tuned and have a wonderful day.